In a small-town cafe, Linda Hayes defies her callous manager, Grant, to protect Max, a blind, retired military canine abandoned by the world. Facing hostility and job loss, Linda's compassion shines as she honors Max's heroic past. Just as she's fired, soldiers arrive, revealing Max's life-saving service in Afghanistan. Their arrival exposes the town's cruelty, sparking a reckoning. Who are these soldiers, and what secrets do they hold about Max? Will Linda's stand change hearts, or is it too late for redemption? The story unfolds with hope, loyalty, and a hero's second chance. Love stories of loyalty and redemption? Subscribe to my channel for more tales that inspire. Your support helps share stories of unsung heroes like Max. Join our community, hit that subscribe button, and let's honor veterans together. Every like and share makes a difference. The Morning Sun Café sat tucked into a quiet corner of a small western town, its windows kissed by frost on winter mornings, its air filled with the comforting hum of soft jazz. The place was a haven for regulars, construction workers gulping down black coffee, elderly couples lingering over shared plates of pancakes, mothers with strollers swapping tales of sleepless nights. Linda Hayes, 33, moved through the bustle with the grace of someone who'd long mastered the art of keeping it together. Her cream-colored uniform, worn thin at the seams, clung to her frame, and her blonde hair was swept into a no-nonsense ponytail. Her smile, though, was a beacon, warm, real, and offered freely despite the early hour and the ache in her feet. For 3 years, she'd poured herself into this job, ever since her divorce left her scrambling to pay bills and rebuild a life from the ashes. The cafe wasn't much, but it was her lifeline. This morning, though, carried a different weight. Near the entrance, a German shepherd sat with quiet dignity, his gray muzzle a map of years gone by. An orange service vest hung loosely over his thin frame, and a small, weathered sign dangled from his collar, K9, retired blind. His clouded eyes gazed into nothingness, but his ears flicked at every sound. The clatter of a spoon, the rustle of a newspaper, the soft giggle of a child. Linda's chest had tightened when she found him yesterday, wandering near the bus station, his steps faltering, no owner in sight. No one had come looking for him, no one had called out his name. Just an old soldier, abandoned, his purpose stripped away. She'd led him to the cafe's quietest corner, setting out a bowl of water and some crumbled muffins. His tail had stirred faintly, a ghost of gratitude in a world that seemed to have turned its back on him. Linda couldn't stop thinking about him. Alone, cold, his world reduced to sounds and scents he could no longer see. She imagined the life he'd lived, the chaos of battlefields, the weight of a soldier's trust. Had he once stood tall, ears pricked, ready to risk everything for those he served? Now his ribs jutted beneath his coat, and his breaths came in shallow rasps, each one a quiet fight to keep going. She wanted to kneel beside him, to whisper that he was still enough, that someone still cared. But kindness didn't sit well with everyone. A man at table 4, his voice loud enough to cut through the morning's warmth, shattered the calm. "That filthy mutt's ruining my breakfast. This isn't a damn shelter." Linda's stomach knotted, but she kept her composure, hoping to smooth things over. Before she could speak, Grant Mitchell, the manager, barreled toward her, his thin face twisted with irritation. Grant was a man of sharp edges, cheekbones like blades, a tongue that cut deeper, and a heart that valued profit over people. "Linda, what the hell are you thinking?" that he snapped, his voice loud enough to silence the room. "This is a business, not a charity for strays. Get that dog out of here." Linda's grip tightened on the coffee pot, her knuckles pale. She met Grant's glare, her voice calm but laced with a quiet fire. "His name's Max, Mr. Mitchell. He's a retired military K9. He served our country, went blind for it. Someone abandoned him out there alone." Her words carried a weight she hadn't expected, a plea for a shred of compassion, but Grant's eyes stayed cold, unyielding. "I don't give a damn who he served. Health codes don't bend for sob stories. Dogs don't belong in restaurants." The cafe froze, the jazz overhead clashing with the tension below. A little boy at a nearby table, his face lit with wonder, tugged at his mother's arm. "Mommy, can I pet him? He looks nice." His mother's hand snapped out, yanking him back with a sharpness that made him shrink. "Absolutely not." That thing's dirty. It could be carrying who knows what, or bite you. The words hit Linda like a slap, each one a dismissal of the dog who'd asked for nothing but a corner to rest in. She knelt beside Max, her hands settling on his back, feeling the faint, recent fall of his chest, the sharpness of his ribs. When had he last eaten a proper meal? When had anyone seen him as more than a nuisance? Grant's voice boomed again, now a performance for the gawking customers. Linda, if you keep that animal in my cafe, you're finished. No job, no money. Am I clear? The threat crashed over her, and her mind spun. She needed this job. Her rent, her groceries, her fragile stability depended on it. But as she looked at Max, his head tilting slightly toward her touch, something inside her shifted. She knew what it was to be cast aside, to wonder if you still had a place in the world. Her divorce had left her raw, piecing herself back together in a town that didn't care to notice. Max, with his unseeing eyes and quiet resilience, felt like a mirror to her own survival. The customers' faces swam around her. Some softened with sympathy, others hardened with irritation. Most just watched, unwilling to step into the fray. The silence pressed in, broken only by Max's faint, labored breaths. Linda's fingers brushed the small American flag pin in her apron pocket, one she'd saved for Memorial Day to honor veterans. On impulse, she pulled it out and clipped it to Max's collar, beside his service tag. His name is Max, she said, her voice low but steady, ringing with a conviction that surprised even her. He saved lives overseas. He deserves better than being tossed aside. Outside the cafe's wide windows, being unnoticed by the crowd caught in the standoff, a line of military vehicles pulled to a stop. The bell above the door chimed, sharp and sudden, and the heavy thud of army boots echoed across the hardwood. Every head turned, and Linda's breath caught in her throat. Who were these soldiers? And what did they know about the blind K-9 that no one else in the Morning Sun Cafe seemed to grasp? The rumble of military vehicles pulling up to the curb broke the quiet hum of the small-town morning. Soldiers in crisp dress uniforms stepped out, their faces carved with determination and purpose, moving with the precision of those who knew their mission but carried its weight in silence. Yet Linda Hayes barely noticed them. Her eyes, her heart, her entire world at that moment was fixed on Max, the forgotten hero, whose weary pause had somehow led him to the one person in this sleepy town who could see the depth of his worth. Linda hadn't always been a woman scraping by on tips at the Morning Sun Cafe, her hands rough from endless hours of wiping counters and refilling coffee mugs. Once she'd been the bright-eyed daughter of Fire Captain James Hayes, raised in a home that buzzed with the camaraderie of first responders and veterans. Her childhood was steeped in stories of sacrifice, told by men and women whose eyes held shadows of battles fought, some on distant soil, others in the quieter wars of the heart. The Hayes household was a haven for retired firefighters, police officers, and soldiers, their laughter and pain mingling over her father's famous chili. From them, Linda learned a truth Hollywood rarely captured. Heroes weren't always the polished figures on posters. Sometimes they limped, sometimes they were invisible. Sometimes they needed someone to kneel beside them and whisper, "You're still enough." In college, Linda had poured her energy into volunteering at a regional K-9 training facility where she helped shape rambunctious puppies into disciplined partners for military and police work. She marveled at their transformation, how their playful bounds gave way to focused strides, their instincts honed into tools of service. She'd seen the spark in their eyes as they learned to navigate danger, their loyalty a quiet promise to the humans who would depend on them. But she'd also seen the other side, the older dogs, the ones who returned from duty with graying muzzles and weary bodies. Their eyes still burned with purpose, but their joints ached, and the world they'd served so faithfully often had no place for them anymore. It was there, among those discarded warriors, that Linda first glimpsed the cruelty of a system that could abandon its own. Her own life had mirrored that abandonment in ways she hadn't expected. 18 months ago, her divorce had fractured more than just her marriage. It had shattered her belief in the enduring value of loyalty. Her ex-husband, with his sharp words and sharper impatience, had called her foolish for caring too much. Too much time spent volunteering, he'd said. Too much of her heart poured into causes that didn't pad their bank account or polish their social standing. He wanted a life of convenience, not character, and Linda's refusal to bend broke them apart. Now, working double shifts at the cafe, her days a blur of sore feet and forced smiles just to cover rent, she knew what it felt like to be cast aside when you were no longer useful. The sting of being deemed expendable was a wound she carried quietly, one that throbbed every time she looked at Max. Max, too, had a story, though the regulars at the Morning Sun didn't care to hear it. His full name was Max K97742, a title etched into the faded vest that hung loosely on his frame. For 6 years, he'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan as an explosive detection dog. His nose a lifeline for Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion. Day after day, he'd walked point, his senses cutting through the chaos of war to sniff out hidden IEDs, bombs that could have torn through flesh and bone, ending lives in an instant. His handler, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, had trusted Max implicitly, their bond forged in the crucible of danger. Max's alerts were a language of survival. Danger here. Stop. Trust me. Countless lives were saved because of him, though no one could tally the exact number. In war, you don't always know which step you didn't take, which path you avoided because a 4-legged soldier told you to turn back. The injury that ended Max's career came during his final deployment. A Taliban sniper's bullet, meant for Rodriguez, had ricocheted off a concrete wall, sending shrapnel tearing into Max's face. The physical wounds healed, but the damage to his eyes was irreversible. Blindness meant the end of his service, a forced retirement that severed him from the only life he'd known. Rodriguez had fought to adopt him, his heart heavy with the debt he owed his partner. But the military's bureaucracy was a slow, grinding machine, and by the time the paperwork crawled through, Rodriguez had been reassigned to Germany. Max was left behind, shipped to a retirement facility for military working dogs in Texas. For 3 long years, Max waited in a kennel, his world shrinking to the cold concrete and the distant sounds of younger dogs being chosen. His once sleek coat grew dull, his muzzle grayer with each passing season. Families came and went, their eyes skimming over the blind, nearly 10-year-old dog in favor of puppies with boundless energy and unscarred bodies. The facility, overcrowded and strapped for funds, was a place of fading hope, where the heroes of war were reduced to numbers on a chart. When budget cuts forced the staff to make impossible choices, Max was deemed a liability. Transferred to a civilian shelter, he lasted only a week before being labeled unadoptable. Too old, too broken, too much trouble. And so a dog who'd saved countless lives found himself wandering the streets of a small town, his torn service vest the only evidence of the hero he'd been. Linda had found him yesterday morning near the bus station, his thin frame trembling in the early dawn chill. His vest, emblazoned with K9 retired, was tattered and caked with dirt, but it was the sight of his clouded eyes that stopped her heart. She'd knelt beside him, her knees pressing into the cold pavement, and whispered soft words of comfort. Despite his blindness, Max had leaned into her touch, his head heavy against her hand, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to see him again. That single gesture, a quiet, unwavering trust, cracked something open in Linda's chest. She felt the weight of his loneliness, his abandonment, as keenly as her own. In that moment, she wasn't just a waitress struggling to pay rent. She was the daughter of James Hayes, the girl who'd cradled puppies and honored broken heroes, the woman who refused to let the world's indifference win. As the soldiers approached the curb, their polished boots clicking against the pavement, Linda's hand rested on Max's head, her fingers tracing the scars hidden beneath his fur. She didn't know what they wanted or why they'd come, but she knew this. Max was no longer invisible, not to her, and she would fight for him just as he'd once fought for others, because some heroes, human or hound, deserved to be reminded they still mattered. The diner was a battleground of clinking plates and sharp whispers, but for Linda, it was the weight of Max's presence at her side that anchored her. The old dog, his fur streaked with gray and his eyes clouded by the scars of war, carried a quiet dignity that belied the chaos around him. On his collar, a small American flag pin glinted faintly, a relic from Linda's father, a firefighter who had worn it for 30 years before his death last winter. She had saved it for Memorial Day, a day to honor her father's sacrifice, But when she met Max, a fellow veteran battered by time and neglect, she knew it belonged to him. "You're not alone anymore," she had whispered as she fastened it to his collar, her voice trembling with a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. That moment had felt sacred, a vow to protect a soul who had given everything. Now, surrounded by the cold stares of customers, that vow felt like a fragile shield against a rising tide of disdain. Linda's heart burned with an anger she could barely contain, a righteous fury that surged with every sneer directed at Max. These were the same people who plastered their social media with "support our troops" memes, their profiles dripping with hollow patriotism, yet they couldn't muster a shred of respect for a veteran whose service had been no less real because it was rendered on four legs. Earlier that day, she had pleaded with Grant, the diner's manager, her voice thick with conviction. "Max isn't just a kill," she'd said, her eyes locked on his, willing him to understand. "He served in combat. He saved lives, human lives, Grant." But Grant's response was as unyielding as the diner's chipped countertops. "He's not in combat now, Linda. He's in my restaurant, and he's bad for business." The words were a slap, their callousness a cruel reminder of the world's ingratitude. Max had spent years shielding soldiers, someone's sons, fathers, brothers, ensuring they could return to the families now sitting in this very diner. Yet here he was, reduced to a nuisance, his sacrifices erased by the same people he'd helped protect. Mrs. Patterson, a regular whose face seemed permanently etched with disapproval, wrinkled her nose as if Max's presence was an affront to her senses. "It's unsanitary," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut through the diner's hum. "What if he has fleas? What if he bites someone?" Linda's hands curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms as she fought the urge to unleash the torrent of words building inside her. She wanted to scream, to demand that Mrs. Patterson acknowledge the hero at her feet, to ask how she could so easily dismiss a creature who had risked everything for her country. But Linda held her tongue, her jaw tight with the bitter truth. She needed this job. The tips, the endless shifts, the ache in her legs, they were the thin thread keeping her and Max afloat. She couldn't afford to lose control, no matter how much her heart screamed for justice. The diner's atmosphere grew heavier, the low buzz of conversation giving way to restless murmurs and pointed glances. A small crowd had formed, their eyes darting between Linda and Max, some already signaling for their checks, unwilling to share their meal with what they called a dirty animal. Grant's face was a deepening shade of crimson, his frustration mounting as he watched his customers slip away. Outside, a convoy of military vehicles rolled into the parking lot, their formation precise and deliberate. Through the diner's smudged windows, Linda caught glimpses of soldiers adjusting their dress uniforms, their movements sharp with the discipline of ceremony and honor, qualities Max had once embodied in the chaos of war. But her focus remained on the dog at her feet. Max had settled there, his blind eyes closed, his body relaxed in a rare moment of peace. To him, Linda was a haven, a tether to safety in a world that had turned its back on him. The next morning, Linda returned to the diner with Max at her side, just as she had the day before. Leaving him alone in her cramped apartment wasn't an option. The streets had already been cruel, their noise and chaos overwhelming for a dog still haunted by the disorientation of his past. She had clung to a fragile hope that a night's reflection might soften the hearts of her customers, that they might see Max not as a burden, but as a hero. But that hope was quickly shattered. "Oh God, not again," groaned a businessman at table 3, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the venom in his tone. "I thought management took care of this yesterday. I'm not paying premium prices to eat next to some mangy stray." The words cut deep, each one a fresh wound to Max's dignity. Linda's heart twisted as she guided him toward his usual corner, a quiet spot where he could rest undisturbed. But the diner was a gauntlet of judgment. A group of college students lounged in the corner booth, their laughter sharp and careless. One of them, a lanky kid with a phone always in hand, spotted Max and grinned like he'd struck gold. "This is perfect," he whispered loudly, already aiming his camera. "My TikTok followers are gonna lose it. Worst service dog ever. Can't even see where it's going." Linda's hands shook as she tried to steer Max past the booth, the leash slipping slightly in her trembling grip. Max, sensing her distress, let out a soft whimper, his clouded eyes searching blindly for the source of her pain. The sound only fueled the student's cruelty. "Hear that pathetic whining?" the kid with the phone said, zooming in on Max's face. "This thing's probably diseased. Someone should call animal control." His girlfriend leaned in, giggling. "Wait, get a close-up of its gross eyes. My followers are going to be so grossed out." Linda's vision blurred with tears, her chest tight with a grief too heavy to name. Max was more than a dog to her. He was a symbol of resilience, of loyalty, of everything her father had stood for. To hear him reduced to a mockery, his sacrifice turned into a cheap bid for internet fame, was a wound that cut deeper than any blade. She took a shaky breath, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Please," she said, barely above a whisper. "He's a veteran. He served overseas. He just needs—" "What he needs," cut in a woman from table 7, her voice sharp and cold, "is to be put out of his misery. Look at him, blind, old, probably in pain. The humane thing would be euthanasia." The words struck Linda like a fist, stealing her breath. She looked down at Max, who had pressed his head trustingly against her leg, his warmth a quiet anchor in the storm of cruelty. Tears burned her eyes, threatening to spill as she imagined a world that would so callously discard him after all he'd given. That's when Grant appeared, his presence a dark cloud over the diner. His face was a mask of barely contained rage, his voice low and dangerous as he prepared to deliver the ultimatum Linda had been dreading. His face burned a deep, furious red, brighter than Linda had ever witnessed in her 3 years under his critical eye. Mr. Grant's voice erupted through the cafe, shattering the murmur of conversations and the clink of coffee cups. "That's it!" he roared, his words reverberating with enough force to make the walls seem to quiver. "Linda, you're fired. Effective immediately. I told you yesterday, no animals in my restaurant." His eyes blazed with a volatile mix of anger and triumph, as if he'd been waiting for this moment to cement his authority in front of everyone. Linda stood rooted behind the counter, her heart plummeting into a cold, hollow pit in her stomach. The weight of his words struck her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her dizzy. The cafe's patrons turned to stare, their gazes a mosaic of curiosity, fleeting pity, and cold detachment. A college student in the corner, phone raised like a weapon, zoomed in on her face, capturing every flicker of shock and humiliation for his social media followers. The soft clicks of other phones joined in, a relentless chorus of voyeurism that made her skin prickle with exposure. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the floor, but there was no escape from the dozens of eyes pinning her in place. "Mr. Grant, please," Linda began, her voice trembling but laced with a desperate need to reason. "Max isn't just—" "No buts," Grant snapped, slicing through her words with a sharp wave of his hand. "You made your choice, Linda. The day or the job. Well, congratulations. You chose the dog. Now get out, both of you, and don't come back." His tone was final, a door slamming shut on her livelihood, her stability, her dignity. The cafe fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint clicking of cameras and the occasional hushed whisper. Linda felt the weight of every stare. Some held a glimmer of sympathy, but most carried a quiet relief, as if her removal was the solution to a problem they had all been silently enduring. Her fingers shook as she reached for the ties of her cream-colored apron, the fabric that had been her second skin for 3 years, now feeling foreign, heavy with the sting of betrayal. She fumbled with the knots, her vision blurring as tears welled up, threatening to spill over. Beside her, Max pressed closer, his warm fur brushing against her leg. She could feel his quiet unease, his instinct to protect her even in this moment of chaos. To her, Max wasn't just a dog, he was her anchor, her confidant, the one constant in a world that seemed to shift unpredictably beneath her feet. His presence grounded her, but it also amplified her heartbreak. He deserved better than this. "Come on, Max," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady as she fought to keep herself together. "We're not wanted here." The words tasted like ash, each syllable a reminder of the rejection burning in her chest. She guided Max toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate, as if moving too quickly might shatter her fragile composure. The college student's voice cut through the air behind her, sharp and intrusive. Wait, can you say something for my video? Like, how does it feel to lose your job over a dog? His tone was casual, almost gleeful, as if her pain was just fodder for his audience. Linda paused at the door, her hand resting on the cold metal handle. She turned slowly, facing the room of strangers who had watched her humiliation unfold without a single voice raised in her defense. Her chest tightened, but a spark of defiance flared within her, refusing to let them see her break. "His name is Max," she said, her voice rising above the knot of grief in her throat, stronger than she felt. "He's not just a dog, he's a hero who saved lives in Afghanistan. And losing this job? It doesn't hurt nearly as much as watching all of you treat a veteran like garbage." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, and for a moment the cafe was utterly still. Then she pushed the door open, and the biting winter air rushed in, stinging her face like a slap. Max followed her faithfully, his tail low but still wagging faintly, a small gesture of hope in a world that seemed determined to crush it. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and relentless, as they stepped onto the sidewalk. Linda's heart ached as she looked down at Max, his fur already dampening in the chill. Without thinking, she slipped off her jacket and draped it over his back, shielding him from the rain. They stood there, two figures displaced and unwanted, the world blurring around them as rain mixed with the tears streaming down her cheeks. "What are we going to do now, boy?" she whispered, her voice breaking as she knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she stroked his head. Then a sharp sound cut through the patter of rain, car doors slamming across the street. Linda looked up, startled, as a convoy of vehicles seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Men and women in crisp military uniforms stepped out, their movements purposeful and disciplined. There were at least 20 of them, soldiers, officers, and what looked like high-ranking officials, their faces etched with determination. The rain didn't seem to faze them as they crossed the street, their boots clicking against the wet pavement. The first to approach was a tall African-American man, his dress uniform immaculate despite the weather, captain's bars gleaming on his shoulders. His presence was commanding, his eyes sharp but not unkind as they took in Linda's tear-streaked face and Max's shivering form. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "Are you Linda Hayes?" Linda nodded, confusion swirling in her chest. She was still reeling from the firing, her mind struggling to process this sudden shift. "And this," the captain continued, kneeling down to Max's level, his tone softening as he looked at the dog. "This is Max K-9 7742, formerly of the 2nd Battalion, Alpha Company." Her eyes widened, a spark of disbelief cutting through her fog of despair. "How did you—" she started, but the words caught in her throat. The captain stood, his expression growing solemn. "Ma'am, we've been looking for Max for 6 months, and we've been looking for you since yesterday." By now, the cafe's windows were lined with faces, patrons, and staff alike pressing against the glass, phones raised to capture the scene unfolding outside. Even Mr. Grant had stepped out, his earlier confidence replaced by a nervous uncertainty that made him look smaller, diminished. "I'm Captain James Washington," the officer continued, his voice steady and resonant. "And these soldiers behind me, they all served with Max in Afghanistan. Every one of them owes their life to this dog." A female sergeant stepped forward, her face streaked with tears that mirrored Linda's own. "Max saved my convoy from an IED in Kandahar," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If it wasn't for him, I never would have made it home to my kids." Her words were raw, heavy with gratitude and pain, and Linda felt a pang in her chest as she saw the sergeant's hands tremble. Another soldier, a young corporal with a scar across his cheek, spoke up next. "He found 3 bombs on one patrol alone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. 3 bombs that would have taken us all out. Max didn't just save lives, he gave us a chance to keep fighting, to come home." His eyes locked on Max, and for a moment, Linda saw the weight of memory in his gaze. The kind of bond forged in the chaos of war. The air inside the small-town cafe grew thick with tension as Captain Washington's voice cut through the hum of conversation, commanding the attention of everyone within earshot. His words carried the weight of authority, sharp and clear, as he addressed not just the patrons inside, but the growing crowd spilling out onto the sidewalk. Pointing toward Linda, a woman whose quiet strength had gone unnoticed until now, he declared that she had been the sole caretaker of one of America's most revered military canine veterans. While others had dismissed the aging dog as a nuisance, Linda had poured her heart into giving him the dignity and devotion he deserved after 6 years of selfless service. Her face flushed with a mix of pride and unease. Unaccustomed to being the center of such attention, yet her eyes remained steady, fixed on the graying dog at her side. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere shifted. Grant, the manager who had wielded his authority so carelessly, stood rooted to the spot, his face drained of color, as if the weight of his actions was sinking in for the first time. His usual air of smug control had evaporated, replaced by a flicker of panic as he realized the gravity of the moment. The college student who had been gleefully filming the earlier confrontation, perhaps hoping for viral fame, lowered his phone, his bravado crumbling under the scrutiny of the crowd. Customers who had been quick to judge now shrank back from the windows, their earlier complaints about the dog's presence feeling petty and small. The room was no longer a stage for their casual cruelty. It had become a mirror reflecting their shame. Captain Washington wasn't done. His voice grew firmer, each word deliberate, as he recounted the honors bestowed upon Max, the canine veteran. "We have a Purple Heart with his name on it," he said, his gaze sweeping the room before locking onto the faces pressed against the cafe windows. "We have commendations from 3 commanding officers and letters from soldiers whose lives he saved." He paused, letting the silence amplify his words. The weight of Max's service hung in the air, years of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice that had gone unrecognized by those who saw only a frail, blind dog. Then, with a piercing intensity, he posed a question that cut through the room like a blade. How does a war hero end up fired for showing kindness to another war hero? The silence that followed was suffocating. Every phone that had been raised to capture the drama fell still. The cruel smirks that had curled on lips moments ago vanished, replaced by expressions of unease and guilt. Grant, still frozen in the doorway, seemed to shrink under the weight of the question. His mind raced, replaying the moment he had threatened Linda's job for daring to care for Max. What had seemed like a simple assertion of authority now felt like a grave misstep, one that exposed his smallness in the face of something far greater. The customers, too, felt the sting of their complicity. Their complaints about Max's presence, his graying fur, his slow gait, now seemed trivial, even cruel, in light of his service. Beside Max, a female sergeant knelt, her hands gentle as they traced the contours of his weathered coat. "Hey there, old soldier," she murmured, her voice soft but thick with emotion. She had seen dogs like Max before, partners in the chaos of war, and the sight of him, blind but unbroken, stirred a deep respect within her. Max's tail stirred, a slow wag at first, then faster, as if he sensed the shift in the air. Though his eyes no longer saw, his senses were sharp, catching the familiar scent of military uniforms, the cadence of voices that carried respect rather than disdain. For the first time in months, he felt known, remembered, not as a burden, but as a hero. Captain Washington turned to Linda, his tone softening but no less resolute. "Ma'am, I need you to understand something," he said. "When Max went missing from the shelter, we didn't just sit back. Alerts went out across 3 states, veterans organizations, military networks, social media groups. Everyone was searching for him." His words painted a picture of a community bound by loyalty, a network of soldiers and supporters who refused to let one of their own fade into obscurity. A young corporal stepped forward, his voice trembling with gratitude. "Max sniffed out an IED in Helmand Province that would have wiped out my entire squad," he said, his eyes glistening. "I've got a wife and twin daughters waiting for me at home because of this dog." The words landed heavily, each one a testament to Max's courage, and Linda felt a lump rise in her throat. She had cared for Max out of instinct, out of kindness, but she hadn't fully grasped the depth of his impact until now. Outside, the crowd swelled as words spread through the town. Some came out of curiosity, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding at the cafe. Others came weighed down by shame, having heard whispers of the video that had sparked this moment. a video of Grant threatening to fire Linda for helping Max. Captain Washington's voice carried on, unwavering. Yesterday, that video hit our veteran networks, he said. Within hours, it was everywhere. Grant's face flushed crimson, the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck. The college student, who had hoped to turn the moment into social media clout, now looked as though he wished the floor would swallow him whole. His fingers hovered over his phone, the video still fresh in its memory, a record of his own thoughtlessness. Another soldier, his face weathered by years of service, spoke up. "We drove through the night to get here," he said, his voice steady but fierce. "No way we were letting Max stay lost. And no way we were letting the woman who helped him face this alone." The words were a lifeline for Linda, who had felt so isolated in her quiet battle to protect Max. She stood taller now, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and resolve, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Captain Washington reached into his uniform jacket, producing a small velvet box with a reverence that silenced the crowd. "Linda Hayes," he said, his voice formal but warm, "by order of the Department of Defense, and on behalf of a grateful nation, I present you with the Civilian Service Award for your care of a military working dog veteran." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of sound that washed over the cafe. Even those who had mocked Max earlier joined in, their claps hesitant, their faces burning with embarrassment. Linda's eyes welled up as she accepted the award, her fingers brushing the velvet, her heart torn between pride and the weight of the moment. The captain wasn't finished. He unfolded another document, his movements deliberate. "Max is hereby awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat and the Military Working Dog Service Medal for Distinguished Service," he announced. Kneeling beside it, Max, he carefully pinned the medals to the dog's service vest. Max sat perfectly still, his head held high, as if he understood the gravity of the honor. The crowd watched in awe, some wiping tears from their eyes, others standing in quiet reverence. For Max, the moment was a restoration of his dignity, a recognition of the sacrifices he had made in places far from this small-town cafe. Mrs. Patterson, the customer who had loudly complained about Max's unsanitary presence, stepped forward, her face pale and her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know," she said, her words faltering. "I'm so sorry, so very sorry." The apology was raw, tinged with the shame of someone who had misjudged and now faced the consequences of her words. One by one, others followed. A businessman who had called Max a mangy stray approached Linda, his eyes averted as he pressed a handful of bills into her hand. "For his care," he muttered, unable to meet her gaze. The college student, his bravado long gone, quietly deleted the video from his phone, his fingers trembling as he erased the evidence of his mistake. The cafe, once a place of judgment and indifference, had transformed into a space of reckoning and redemption. Linda stood beside Max, her hand resting on his head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. She had never sought recognition, only to do what was right. But now, surrounded by the applause of strangers and the gratitude of soldiers, she felt a quiet strength settle within her. Max's tail wagged steadily now, a rhythm of trust and recognition, as if he too knew that he was finally home. The rain was relentless that morning, soaking through Linda's coat as she stood outside the Morning Sun Cafe, her fingers wrapped tightly around Max's leash. The sting of Grant's words still echoed in her mind, each syllable a fresh wound. She'd only wanted to help, to offer a moment of kindness, but it had cost her everything, or so she thought. Max, her blind but fiercely loyal companion, pressed his warm body against her leg, sensing her distress. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain, heavy with the confusion and shame of being cast out. Grant lingered in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of the cafe. His face, once taut with frustration, softened as he wrestled with his own regret. "Linda," he called, his voice now laced with a gentleness that hadn't been there before. "Your job's still here if you want it. And Max, he's welcome any time." The offer hung in the air, a flicker of hope amidst the storm. But before Linda could respond, Captain Washington stepped forward, his uniform crisp despite the drizzle, his presence commanding yet kind. "Actually, sir," he said, his tone steady but warm, "Linda won't be needing that job. The Department of Veterans Affairs has an opening in our canine rehabilitation program. If she's interested, she'd be helping retired military working dogs adjust to civilian life. The words landed like a lifeline, pulling Linda from the depths of her despair. She looked down at Max, whose tail was wagging so vigorously it sent his whole body into a joyful dance. For the first time in months, she saw the dog he'd been before war and injury had taken their toll, a spark of happiness that mirrored the hope rising in her own chest. "We take care of our own," Captain Washington added, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. "All of our own, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. The crowd gathered on the rain-soaked street burst into applause. Not the polite kind, but the kind that shakes the soul. Someone started chanting at Max, 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 and soon the entire street joined in, their voices weaving a tapestry of gratitude and pride. Linda knelt beside Max, her knees sinking into the wet pavement, and let the tears come. Tears of joy that washed away the bitterness of earlier ones. "What do you think, boy?" she murmured, her voice trembling with possibility. "Ready to help other heroes like you?" Max's gentle lick across her cheek and the rhythmic thump of his tail said more than words ever could. 6 months later, Linda stood in the sunlit courtyard of the Veterans Affairs Canine Rehabilitation Center, her heart swelling as she watched Max work his quiet miracles. The grass glowed under the morning sun, and Max, blind but undaunted, moved with a grace that belied his limitations. He was guiding Bella, a German shepherd who'd lost her left front leg to an IED in Syria. When Bella had arrived, her eyes were wild with fear, her growls a shield against a world she no longer trusted. But now, lying beside Max in the warm light, she was calm, her body relaxed for the first time since her arrival. Linda's throat tightened with pride as she watched them, 2 survivors finding peace in each other's presence. "He's remarkable," Dr. Sarah Chen, the center's director, said, her voice soft with wonder. She stood beside Linda, her clipboard forgotten as she watched Max nuzzle Bella. "We've never seen anything like it." The other dogs are drawn to him, like he's whispering, "You're safe now. You are home." Linda's smile was small but deep, her eyes tracing the gentle curve of Max's graying muzzle against Bella's. She knew the weight of invisible wounds, the ones she and Max carried silently. The center wasn't just a job, it was her purpose, a place where she and Max could help broken heroes heal. Each day brought new boys, each with their own scars, and each day Linda and Max were there, reminding them that their sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. Captain Washington's visits were a highlight, his boots crunching on the gravel as he shared stories of Max's old unit. He'd talk about the soldiers Max had saved, their lives forever intertwined with the dog who'd stood by them in danger. Recently, he'd shared that Sergeant Rodriguez, Max's first handler, was coming back to the States. In a few weeks, he'd see Max again, after 4 long years. Linda could already picture it, the way Max's ears would perk, his tail a blur of excitement at the sound of Rodriguez's voice. The thought brought tears to her eyes. "You know what the best part is?" Linda said to Dr. Chen, as they watched Max and Bella bask in the sunlight. "Every dog that comes through here goes on to help someone else. Max didn't just save soldiers in Afghanistan. He's still saving lives today." Her voice was steady, but her heart raced with the truth of it. Max's legacy lived on in every dog he helped, every veteran who found solace in his presence. The Morning Sun Café had become a different place since that rainy morning. Grant, perhaps moved by guilt or inspired by Max, had turned it into a sanctuary for veterans. Photos of local heroes, soldiers, medics, and canines lined the walls, their stories told in proud frames. A table in the corner was always reserved for visiting veterans, and the menu now boasted Max's Special, a hearty breakfast with every penny going to canine veteran care. Lakewood itself had transformed, its heart softened by a single act of compassion. The annual No Hero Left Behind festival drew crowds to celebrate all veterans, human and canine, with local businesses vying to support retired military dogs. Linda often thought back to that humiliating morning, when being fired for kindness had felt like the end. But now, watching Max guide Bella toward healing, she saw it as the start of something beautiful. "Loyalty isn't conditional," she told the crowd at last month's festival, her voice strong with conviction. "It doesn't end when service does. It doesn't fade when heroes grow old or broken or forgotten. True loyalty means standing by those who've given everything, no matter what. The auditorium buzzed with the lingering energy of a standing ovation, the kind that ripples through a crowd when something profound has been said. Linda stood on the stage, her heart still racing from the speech she'd just delivered, a tribute to the unsung heroes who stand up for others, no matter how many legs carry them. The applause wasn't just for her words, it was for the bond she shared with Max, the service dog who'd become her lifeline. She scanned the sea of faces, their cheers washing over her like a warm tide, but beneath her composed exterior, a storm of gratitude and vulnerability churned. She'd never been one for the spotlight, yet here she was, speaking for those who couldn't, human or otherwise. As the crowd began to disperse, Linda's gaze softened, her thoughts drifting to the countless moments Max had pulled her through darkness. Every clap felt like an acknowledgement of his courage, not just hers. She adjusted the microphone clipped to her jacket, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric of her coat, and took a deep breath. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. She was here to honor loyalty, the kind that doesn't falter, even when the world feels like it's crumbling. Then through the thinning crowd, a small figure approached, clutching her parents' hands. The little girl's steps were hesitant, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and shyness. Her pigtails bounced slightly as she stopped a few feet away, her parents offering Linda encouraging smiles. The girl's voice, soft and tentative, broke the hum of the room. "My daddy says you saved the doggy hero," she said, her words carrying the innocent weight of a child's truth. Her small hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress, and her eyes flickered toward Max, who sat calmly at Linda's side. Linda's heart swelled, a tender ache spreading through her chest. She knelt down, her knees pressing into the cool floor, bringing herself to the girl's level. The simple act felt like a bridge between them, a way to meet the child in her world. "Oh, sweetie," Linda said, her voice warm and steady, though it trembled with the emotion she tried to keep at bay. "The truth is the doggy hero saved me." She glanced at Max, her partner in every sense of the word, and a soft smile curved her lips. The words weren't just a response. They were a confession, raw and unguarded. She could still feel the weight of those moments when Max's steady presence had been her anchor, guiding her through the fog of fear and uncertainty. Max, ever the picture of quiet dignity, shifted slightly beside her. The purple heart pinned to his service vest gleamed under the auditorium's lights, a symbol of his bravery, earned through trials most could scarcely imagine. His tail thumped gently against the floor, a rhythmic beat that seemed to echo his contentment. Though his eyes were clouded, sight stolen by time and hardship, they held a depth that spoke of understanding far beyond what words could capture. He couldn't see the little girl's curious gaze or the way her parents' faces softened with admiration, but he didn't need to. Max could sense the warmth in the air, the unspoken connection between him and the people around him. It was a language of the heart, one he'd mastered long ago. To Max, the world was a tapestry of sounds, scents, and feelings. The little girl's voice, high and sweet, reached him like a melody, stirring memories of other voices. Linda's, steady and kind, even in the worst moments. The shouts of chaos he'd once navigated, the quiet murmurs of gratitude that followed. His tail wagged a little faster, a silent agreement with Linda's words. He hadn't just been her protector, she'd been his purpose. Every step he took, every nudge of his nose against her hand, was a vow to keep her safe, to be the strength she needed when her own faltered. The purple heart on his vest was a badge of his sacrifice, but the love he felt in this moment, surrounded by people who saw him not just as a beau, but as a hero, was his true reward. The little girl tilted her head, her brow furrowing as she processed Linda's words. To her, the idea that a dog could save a person was both magical and confusing. She reached out a tentative hand, then paused, looking up at her parents for permission. Her mother nodded, and the girl's fingers brushed Max's fur, gentle as a whisper. Max leaned into her touch, his warmth a quiet reassurance. The girl giggled, a sound that seemed to light up the room, and Linda felt a lump rise in her throat. This was why she'd spoken today. Not for the applause, but for moments like this, where a child could see what loyalty really meant. Linda watched the girl's face glow with wonder, and her thoughts drifted to the journey she and Max had shared. There had been days when the world felt too heavy, when her own strength wasn't enough. Max had been there, his steady presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. She thought of the nights he'd lain beside her, his breathing a quiet rhythm that lulled her fears to sleep. She thought of the times he'd sensed her distress before she could name it, guiding her forward with a nudge or a soft whine. To the world, she might be the one who'd saved him, but in her heart, she knew the truth. Max had been her salvation as much as she'd been his. The girl's parents stood close, their expressions a mix of pride and gratitude. The father's hand rested on his daughter's shoulder, and Linda could see the unspoken appreciation in his eyes. He, too, had been moved by the story of Max, a dog who'd faced unimaginable challenges yet never wavered in his devotion. It was a story that resonated deeply, a reminder that heroism doesn't always wear a human face. Linda felt a flicker of pride, not for herself but for Max, for the way he'd touched lives without ever seeking recognition. As the girl stepped back, still beaming, Linda rose to her feet, her hand resting lightly on Max's head. The crowd had mostly cleared now, but the moment lingered, heavy with meaning. Max's tail gave one final wag as if to seal the moment in time. He might not see the world the way others did, but he felt it. Every ounce of love, every thread of respect woven into the air around him. To him, this was home, not a place, but a feeling, built on the bond he shared with Linda and the people who saw him for what he truly was. The story of Linda and Max wasn't just theirs. It was a call to remember the quiet heroes, the ones who stand by us through the storm, whether they walk on two legs or four. It was a reminder that loyalty, the kind that endures beyond words, often comes with a wagging tail and a heart that never gives up.